Stacy Murphy here. Let's talk tomatoes. If you are in the northern hemisphere, then hopefully you have more tomatoes than you know what to do with, because soon fall will be upon us and the cold will start to set in. And for a lot of us, that means our tomatoes are going to disappear and we're going to start to harvest green tomatoes. So what I wanted to do as the season winds down is to share a quick video, 5 tips on how to get the most out of your tomato harvest. This is before you even take it inside to eat it or to preserve it. So these are things that you can do in your garden space now. And even if you grow tomatoes in a part of the world where winter is not approaching, where maybe you don't even have winter, a lot of times tomato plants, they get old, they die of old age, and you want to get the most out of that tomato harvest at the end of the life cycle of that plant. So these tips apply to that as well. And if you're like most people, then tomatoes are a big reason why you garden. So here you go, 5 tips to get the most out of your tomato harvest. One of the goals when we're harvesting from our garden is that we pick things when they are perfectly ripe. So if we harvest before things are fully mature, typically crops have less flavor. And if we harvest when things are overripe, typically we get a shorter shelf life in the kitchen. And while that second bit is definitely true for tomatoes, they can go bad in the kitchen very easily. The first is not necessarily true of tomatoes, which is one of the reasons why there's a giant love affair between gardeners and tomatoes, because we can really play with the plant to get the most out of the harvest, and that's what we'll be talking about. And within different crop families, oftentimes harvest techniques are similar within crop families, but not so much so for tomatoes in relationship to the rest of their family. So tomatoes are a special plant and require some special care. So that's what we'll be talking about. So the first tip is super simple. You probably heard this before. Cut the heirloom tomatoes off the vine with clippers. So where the tomato branch connects to the tomato, there is what's called a caliph. That's that little green sprouty thing. And you want to cut just above that caliph. And the reason you want to cut instead of pulling the tomato off the vine is that tomato skins can be very fragile, and if you can damage by pulling because you're gripping the tomato, so you might actually bruise the tomato that way. And the other damage that you might incur is as you're pulling, that caliph might not give way from the tomato, and you might actually rip the skin around the top of the tomato, and that's where bacteria and mold can start to enter that tomato. So you want to clip off the vine whenever possible. And especially when you have, in this case, this is some water damage on some tomatoes. Splitting and cracking is oftentimes the case of irregular water. You might have had a giant storm come along and a big surge of water and all of your skins cracked. You definitely want to cut these off the vine, because if you try to pull, you can really damage that skin even more. The second tip is to not crush your harvest. And while this sounds very obvious, I see oftentimes people piling up their tomatoes really high, and I think that you want to make sure that you are not going to split your tomatoes, and one of the ways that you can do that is to pile them up, and any that have some sensitive skin issues can burst. So you especially don't want to put your large tomatoes on top of your small tomatoes. That's something that I definitely would not do. I would harvest them separately. So don't pile them up too high. What I would recommend is that the container that you harvest into is smooth. So here we harvest our giant tomatoes into plastic trays, and oftentimes we're just doing one layer of tomatoes along the bottom, and we actually face our tomatoes caliph side down so that the top surface is the most, well, in this case the top, but the bottom of the tomato, the skin is the most fragile. So you don't want to rest all the weight on that most fragile part of the tomato. That's the most ripe part of the tomato. So if you harvest face up, then you have less likely a chance that you will bruise the bottom sides of your tomatoes or puncture the skin of the bottom side of your tomato. And then also with cherry tomatoes, what I like to do is harvest them into their final containers. And so this depends on if you're giving them away or if you're keeping them all to yourself. But I like to have multiple containers, small containers to put them into, so that they're not in one giant bowl. Because what I found is that when you put them in a giant bowl, any cherry tomatoes that are likely to split, they will split, and then you'll end up with like a messy puddle in your cherry tomato container. So separate them into smaller containers so that they don't crush each other. And here is a really cool harvest basket that's handmade. It's a little box, and that is a hose a garden hose repurposed as a handle. It's just nailed, screwed into the side of the box. Third tip is to remove those kalifs before you store your tomatoes. And this is specific to cherry tomatoes. So what I would recommend is as you harvest, take those kalifs off so that if you have a container full of cherry tomatoes and they start rolling around and bumping up against each other, those kalifs are sharp and they can puncture the skin of those cherry tomatoes. So as you pull the cherry tomatoes off the branch, so with the large tomatoes, you're actually clipping them off. With cherry tomatoes, you're pulling them off. And what happens with cherry tomatoes is that the ripe ones, the kalifs will come off automatically. But the underripe tomatoes, the kalif will come with the tomato, and those are the kalifs that you want to pull off carefully and then put everything in one container. The next tip is that you want to make sure you separate out your split tomatoes at harvest. So you don't want to wait to do this. So let's look at these two tomatoes on the screen. The one on the left is a split tomato that's overly ripe split tomato. And what's going on, I would say, is that this split has been open for quite some time. You can see that there is the edges are kind of a different color, and there's some interesting things going on the inside of this. So a split tomato has the possibility of a bacteria or a fungus getting into it. So different people have different levels of comfortability with eating split tomatoes. I would eat the split tomato on the right. It looks like it just split open. The edge is a very clean split, and it's a very small split. So when the split gets splayed open, like the one on the left, that's when I stop eating it. If the edges start to look like a different color, I won't eat it. The one on the right, that looks like a good tomato to me. So what I would do is I would separate out the split tomatoes at harvest. Sometimes I'll throw the split tomatoes that are overripe that I'm not going to eat. Sometimes I'll just throw them on the ground in hopes that I'll get some volunteer tomato plants next year from them. And then I take the split tomatoes, I make sure the calif is off, and I put them into a separate container. So this is why I have separate containers with me when I'm harvesting cherry tomatoes. I don't just have one bucket, I have multiple pints or multiple containers. And if I get a bunch of split cherry tomatoes, I'll put them in a separate container. Now, why do I separate them out? Basically, you want to use those split tomatoes right away versus the other tomatoes that you can save. So what I like to do is I take my split cherries right away, I dump them on a roasting tray. I sometimes add some herbs, some olive oil, throw them in the oven, and then basically roast them, pull them out, and then you can refrigerate them from there for use on whatever you want, or you can have a little party with your neighbors. I like to make bruschetta and some other things where tomatoes are a lovely roasted topping. You can make a pasta sauce out of this, whatever you want to make. And so I oftentimes find that I can make quite a few dinners out of these roasted split cherries right away, some kinds of pasta sauces and such like that. And trust me, you're going to save so much time and energy by separating them out before you bring them into your kitchen. Doing that in the field, you can just then dump all the split ones onto the tray, and you don't have to do any digging through the piles. And the other reason you save your time and energy is that what I have found is that by digging through the tray of cherry tomatoes, let's say you have a big bowl of cherry tomatoes and you're trying to find the split ones, as you do that, you sometimes split more cherry tomatoes. So I found that the most effective way to separate them out is to actually do it as you're harvesting and have separate buckets available for those two different types. Okay, so up until now we've been talking about how to make the most out of what we got, how to make sure that we get the most tomatoes off the vine and into our kitchen without losing them to splitting, or if they do split, here's what we can do about it. And now we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about how to get more fruit out of your plants. So we want to talk about how to force your plant to ripen more fruit. And first we have to understand what ripening is. And basically ripening is the aging process of the tomato, and they're trying to reproduce. And so basically what happens in the tomato is that green chlorophyll breaks down and other pigments start to surface. And what happens in that process is a softening of the tomato, and the sugar content rises. And this all serves to attract animals who will basically chew up those fruits. Those seeds go into the stomach through the system of the animal. They actually poop out the seeds, and the process starts all over again. So that's what the plant wants. So that's what the ripening process is. And as long as the ripening process has started, it will complete itself. So on the screen here, you see 3 tomatoes that are not green. And the first tomato, this is a sun gold plant, and that one is almost ripe. And then the second one is less than ripe, and the third one is just starting to turn color. And if it were me, I would pull all 3 of these tomatoes off the vine. And what that would do is it would force the next one in the row to start to ripen. So cherry tomatoes will grow in these tendrils, and basically they will ripen along this path. And so they ripen in turn. So the minute we take off these top 3, the next one gets the message that it needs to start to ripen. So if we pull them off slightly before they're ready to come off, then we're speeding up the process. And so with cherry tomatoes, what I like to do is to harvest every 2 days at the end of the season, just before fall, and make sure I get all the ones that are already turning off the vine. I like to separate out the 3 different colors that are shown here as some that are ripe, medium ripe, and barely turning. And that way I can track them separately. So I put them in 3 different types of containers. This is why I have multiple containers with me whenever I harvest cherry tomatoes, some for split and then different containers for different colors as well. And so I'm going to let some of these ripen on my countertop for a while. And the next way to force that plant to ripen even more fruit is basically to remove any excess foliage. And so as the plant is getting older and we're about to pull it out of the ground, if winter is approaching, or if the plant is starting to die of some sort of disease, what I will do is pull off all of the foliage on the lower part of the plant. The plant only needs about 50% of its leaves to photosynthesis and continue living, so I will take off the bottom 50%, the old foliage that the plant is taking up energy, sending energy into those leaves. So you might as well pull it all off and send more energy into the fruit. And you do want to leave some foliage on the plant because photosynthesis is the way that the plant is bringing sugar into those tomatoes, so you do need foliage. So you're probably thinking now, wait, at the beginning of the presentation you said that fruit that wasn't yet ripe, sometimes the flavor isn't as good. And so tomatoes are one of those crops. It's kind of interesting. It depends on the variety, how it will taste if it ripens off the crop. The best tasting tomato you will ever taste will be a tomato that ripens on the vine. It's perfectly ripe, and you pluck it in the midday on a sunny day. It's warm from the sun. That will be the best tomato you ever have. But you will get about 90% of the way there by harvesting and allowing them to ripen on your countertop. For many varieties, specifically cherry tomatoes, the flavors don't really change. There are some tomatoes that it really does affect their flavor, and so what I would say is decide, are you growing salad tomatoes or roasting tomatoes? Or can you split your tomatoes in half and say, okay, well, I'm going to harvest these over here I harvested, they're very ripe, these are going to be salad tomatoes. These over here I harvested and I'm going to let them ripen away from the vine. Their flavor might not be quite as good, so I'm going to make those into my roasting and canning tomatoes. So that's the decision that you can make, and force more tomatoes to come in before your first frost sets in, essentially. Now, a couple tips as you bring these tomatoes into your kitchen. Most of you probably already know this, but I just want to reiterate. Never put your tomatoes in a water bath. A lot of our other crops we put in a water bath to cool them and get them ready for storage. And so a lot of crops like cool storage, 60 degrees lower. For root crops, they like 35 degrees and lower, but not so for tomatoes. Tomatoes like as much as possible to be at room temperature until until they become ripe or overripe, at which case you can put them in the fridge. So a lot of people ask, should you ever put your tomatoes in the fridge? The answer really is that you don't want them to mature, you don't want them to ripen in the fridge, because what's going to happen is the minute you put a tomato in the fridge, the cold temperature starts to break down the cell walls of the tomato and it starts to make it a little mealy. And it does affect the flavor just a hair sometimes for some varieties. So what you want to do to optimize everything is to leave tomatoes out on the counter as much as possible, use them when they're ripe, but if they get ripe and you can't use them all, then you want to put them in the fridge for a day or two. You really don't want to go for more than a day or two. All right, that's a little bit about how I maximize my tomato harvest at the end of the season, just before winter hits, or if I'm in a climate where there is no winter, when my plants are starting to die off. And I hope that you've gotten some good tips here. If you have any tips of your own, please share in the comment section below. Would love to hear from you, and I'll see you on the next video.